part of what we'll talk about today. We're going to look a little bit at an example. I asked you to read a couple of sample research papers we had at Canvas. I want to look through one example with you in terms of kind of as a model of what we're working toward. I want to have an opportunity for small groups to talk a little bit about where you are with your projects again. We'll look at timing for spring semester, how things are going to play out, give some time for questions, and then we'll lay out kind of the agenda for January meeting during the common time and what we're going to do between now and then. So let's start here with the sample research paper. I wanted to, I think it's always helpful going along here to have the kind of the vision of when I finish my research project, what does the end product supposed to look like, right? And so the things that we've looked at in the past, articles that were published by people are sort of the polished, final published product of somebody, and not really the research paper that they necessarily wrote for a class, you know, because that's kind of the starting point. And so one of the things that cohort 1 last year, those that did the project, didn't have was any kind of a model. And so as we got into the spring semester last year, people were like, you know, it'd be really nice if we could see something that somebody else wrote, what their final paper looked like, so I have some idea of kind of where I'm headed toward it. And we have to keep in perspective that the final paper isn't the be-all end-all, right? The be-all end-all is the project and learning something, and you're just writing it up in a paper. So, you know, the bottom line is what we really want you to do is, you know, to learn from the project, to become better teachers because of it. And I've actually been doing some work. Dr. Bostic and I are writing a paper together for a conference we're going to speak at in San Antonio in February. And one of the things that we're speaking about in the conference is how action research plays into making us better teachers. And one of the things that I have been researching on the web in the last few weeks is how teachers are making use of action research in their own classes and what effect it's having on their teaching. And it's really fascinating to find. What I'm discovering is that one of the things that a lot of the studies are starting to show, or have been showing, I guess, for a while, is that when we do action research, it allows us in a sort of a systematic way to look at something that's going on in our classroom and to ask the hard questions of, is what I'm doing really working? Is it really making a difference? You know, is this a behavior as a teacher that I should be repeating in the future because I know it works? Or is this something I should be dumping because I know it doesn't work? And what a lot of the researchers are saying is that there's a big difference between that and simply having anecdotal evidence, right? The anecdotal evidence is you talk to that one kid as he's leaving the class one day that says, you know, it was really interesting today, I learned a lot. You think, oh, the whole class did. You know, well, wait a minute. You know, there were 25 other people in the room, and it's possible that 23 of them didn't learn a thing today. I just happened to talk to that one kid that did learn something. So what am I doing systematically to gather data to make sure that my class, or a majority of my class, is really benefiting from what I do? So there's a big difference between that anecdotal data of just seeing how 1 or 2 students are doing versus really systematically gathering some data to find out whether your teaching strategies or the way you're running your classroom is really, you know, working and effective. So that's the difference between sort of an anecdotal piece and really systematically gathering data. I think the same thing is true even in the classroom when you raise some questions to your students. You throw a question out, a bunch of kids raise their hand, and you get the impression everybody knows what's going on. The reality is there's 10 hands up and there's 15 hands that aren't. And of those 15, probably half or more of them really have no clue what's going on. That's why they're not raising their hand. And we get the impression, because we see a bunch of hands waving in our faces, that everybody gets it. And in reality, they're not getting it at all. It's just that you got a few kids that happen to raise their hand, and anecdotally, we think that means the whole class gets it, and really they don't. So it's that systematic way of being able to gather data. So we had, I posted at Canvas 3 different articles, and one of them was from a middle childhood person that wrote a paper. How many of you read that middle childhood paper, or at least scanned through it? Okay, so I asked you to look at 2 of the 3 papers, and you may or may not have chosen that one. But let me just, what I want to do is look at that article specifically for a minute. Just kind of, I'm going to just sort of do a quick walkthrough of the article so that we kind of get an idea back in our heads of what it includes and kind of how this person went about doing the research project. So, you know, the front page is kind of your cover page. I didn't put the, deleted names in specific schools and so forth out of it, but using games in the classroom was the purpose for the paper. And the paper starts off with this 1-paragraph abstract in italics. And the purpose of the abstract is to tell us, in general, what did I do, what did I find out? Using games in a middle school math classroom provides benefits for students other than just communication skills. So I had fourth graders play a game, Fraction Swirl, which is a variation of the commercial game Fraction Whirl. Students took a pre-assessment and a post-assessment, and I interviewed 2 students. Remember we talked about triangulating data? So part of it is kind of test data, but then the other part of it is let's sit down with a couple of kids and talk about what they really got out of this experience. And if we put the interview data together with the test scores, that may tell us more, What do we find out? Over half the class improved their individual scores, and the passing rate went from 28% of the pre-assessment to 56% of the post-assessment. It confirms that it had some kind of an effect on their understanding of equivalent fractions. So that's kind of the overview. Back in 3160 last year, when you were first starting about thinking about your projects, you wrote kind of an introduction and a literature review. So just to kind of review that, the introduction is that part that tells me what are you going to study, what are you interested in. So that's where we are right now, actually with the 3160 group that are going to be doing methods in student teaching next year, is they're into that phase right now, trying to decide what are they interested in and why. So person starts their paper off. Today teachers are looking for alternative ways to engage their students in lessons. To do this, teachers are moving forward toward using different kinds of technology, computers, digital cameras, etc. And conversely, what teachers using modified games in their classroom, can that help students grasp more fully? So this is not really a cited piece of research. This is kind of more of an introduction to this is what I'm interested in and why I'm interested in it. Currently, I'm working on my Bachelor of Education in Middle Childhood Education. I've been in several different math classrooms for observations, and I noticed one thing. Teachers are not using games in their classrooms. And so I'm wondering, what would be the effect of using games? Okay? Now, once we've stated the problem, then the next step is to say, all right, here's what the issue is. I'm interested in games, but I'm not the first person in the world that's ever researched games in the classroom. So let me do a lit review, right? So the lit review, as you worked on, is to say, what have other people already found out about the use of games in their classroom? So while researching the topic, I found there's a small amount of research on it. A lot of the research has been done about technological games and video games, but limited research on using commercial games in a math classroom. So what does that limited research tell us? So this person goes on and on for a couple of pages kind of explaining, as you've done, what do we know from other research. And each case, citing where that study came from. Here's a study that was done back in 1985, and here's what this author found out. Here's a study from 2008 showing a growing body of research is revealing the potential benefits of using games in a classroom. And so they go through and cite what other people have already done on the topic to kind of make a compelling argument of this is worth studying and other people have already studied it. And then we get to that third section, which is the methodology, right? So you've thought about that. How am I actually going to do the research? So I want to know how well games are working in my classroom, so how am I systematically going to study that to figure out whether the game is having an effect? So the study that was, notice by the way that this shifts to when you wrote your methodology section last year, you wrote it kind of in the future tense, saying I am planning to do this, and now by the time you write the final paper, you will have done this. And so you'll want to change the tense in that section to say this is what I did, as opposed to here's what I'm going to do. But otherwise, you can keep a lot of the text the same, unless you're significantly changing your topic or your methodology from last year, which we've given you the green light to do if you want to do. Participants in the study were comprised of one fourth grade class. There were 30 students. All the students were exposed to the same experiences, and the commercial game chosen focused on equivalent fractions. I did the study over a 4-week period. Students started by taking a pre-assessment, etc. And so they walk us right through how this was being done. The pre-assessment that was done, type of data that was gathered, and then we get to, so once there's a description of how the study was going to be conducted, here's the data and here is the analysis, okay? So now I've actually done that. I gave the pre-test, I gave the post-test, I interviewed kids. Here's what I found out. 26 students took the pre-assessment. There were 4 questions. The first 2 asked them to circle representations. An example of this is given below, and they walk us right through the type of questions that kids were asked, how they responded with little bar graphs showing how they performed on the different questions. And they walk us right through this. This is all of the data that they found. When looking further, I found that these students all drew pictures. However, each student did not give a right answer. This is how they responded, blah, blah, blah. And then the last question was, etc. So they provide a rubric, again, some scores. Comparing the pre-assessment to the post-assessment. After slightly evaluating question 4, I decided to go back and look at how each student did on the pre-assessment in comparison to the post-assessment. So let's start with Anna. Here's what Anna did. And these are all fictitious names, right? So anytime you use names in your writing, you don't want to identify who the actual student is, create fictitious names for them and go from there. I still remember some of the fictitious names I've used, and I was pretty creative about it. So there they are. Anna received a perfect score on question 4, blah, blah, blah. And it tells us about each one of these people, kind of analyzes their answers. And then they get an interview. Okay, so I interviewed some of these students, a couple of them. Molly was the second student I interviewed. Molly stated she did, in fact, enjoy playing the game because it was kind of hard, but kind of easy. What's that mean? Since Molly felt this way, I wanted to see what she thought was hard, so I asked her more probing questions, and she said it was hard because we had to move really fast and easy because it was easy if you had to tell if you had a match or not. So I wanted to know if she could tell a match or not, and she said all looked the same. So there's a description here of what Molly talked about in the interview. By the way, notice how the data changed from quantitative to qualitative. Right? Did you catch that? So the quantitative data was the pre-test and post-test scores. Those are the numbers. And now we're going into more of a qualitative approach. I talked to 2 of the students when I interviewed them. Here are some of the things that they said. And so they go through and describe that. And then the last section is, so what's my conclusion? What are the implications here? In conclusion, I feel that having students play fraction swirl enhanced student understanding of equivalent fractions. There is a definite impact on student understanding, which can be seen in my data. And goes through and explains that. And by the way, if the data doesn't support that, that's okay. Because it would have been perfectly okay to me and perfectly okay to the student's advisor if when they collected all the data and looked at the pre-test and post-test and did the interviews, that it turns out that it really wasn't very useful to play the game at all. That's okay. That's publishable. Okay? Because you don't have to publish, when you publish something in a journal, it doesn't have to be, it isn't always published because it worked. Sometimes it's good to publish it because it didn't work. And then people can look at that and say, oh, that's interesting. That's different from what I found, or that's the same as what I found in my classroom. You know? So there should be nothing wrong. Don't consider it in any way wrong or that you're a failure if your study doesn't show what you hypothesized that it might show. If this person would have come to the conclusion that playing that game just did absolutely no good for the class, and here's why, that's fine. So write about that. Tell me why it did no good and what you found out. Okay? Because there's no right or wrong answer to a study. That's what's cool about writing about research, is that there is no right answer. There is, here's what I gathered, here's what I found out. So this person goes through and explains that, and then in the end, I'll go up to this paragraph here. Through having this opportunity, I not only learned more about myself and my students as well. I learned that I enjoy researching if games help students. I learned there's a lot of work that has to be done before they can play the game. They talked a little bit on a previous paragraph here about limitations, that there's some things that there's several things that I feel would have made this action research better. I wish I had had a better balance of difficulty level between pre and post assessment, looking back so the person's reflecting on, here's how my study could have been better if I'd have done it differently, and here's what I learned, and there's my conclusions. And then here's my list of references that I've used in my paper. Okay, so I want to summarize here what some of the main sections were, and then see if we got questions that you might have at this point. So bottom line is, if you look at the syllabus for 4160, it lays out that a research paper, and not just for our class, but in general, any research paper where you're writing, whether it be for action or for something that you want to publish at some point in the future, or something you want to just write up for your school or whatever, always begins with a title page that has an abstract. It will always have an introduction that addresses, so what is the problem I'm interested in? It'll have a literature review. What research has already been done in that area? What do we know before I even start my study? How am I going to collect the data? And notice I put the tense change here. So when you write a proposal, it's how will I collect the data? And when you write the paper, it's here's how I did it. Okay. An analysis of the data. What are my results and what did they tell me? What are the implications? In other words, what are the main conclusions I can draw from my findings? And then lastly, what are my sources? So in a sense, before even getting to this year, you kind of looked at your introduction, a topic, a lit review, some idea of methodology, and now we're going to be collecting data and drawing our conclusions. And you piece all of that together into a final research paper. Okay? Um, so, any questions about that? You think about the article we just looked at, the paper that somebody else wrote, steps here. Is this all making sense to you?